Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
They came from all 50 states, some to rally for their president, others to answer a call to arms, descending on the U.S. Capitol in the most shocking challenge to U.S. democracy since the Civil War. 5 years on, Donald Trump enters his second year of another term in the White House amid an ongoing rewriting of the history of that day. But cracks have since emerged in his MAGA base, dividing supporters, including those who have gone to violent lengths to keep the president in power. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to political science professor Aaron Ettinger at Carleton University about what those divides within MAGA mean for Trump. Professor Ettinger, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
I wonder now, 5 years on from January 6th, how that day stands out to you.
Well, it stands out to me in a very kind of strange personal sense. I had January 6th circled on my calendar for two reasons. One, it was the certification day for the presidential election that Donald Trump lost and Joe Biden won. It was also the date where I was scheduled to take possession of a bunch of furniture that I had ordered. And remember, this was pandemic era stuff, and there were all sorts of supply chain delays. So I had been waiting many months to receive this order. So, in my living room, I had the TV was on the floor and everything was disassembled. And I knew that this important moment in American democracy was happening. So I flipped on the television set as it sat on the floor in the middle of my living room amidst all the Allen keys to check what was going on in Washington. And then lo and behold, I was greeted with this very unexpected news story about a riot or an insurrection at the Capitol. So I tried to follow that story in the midst of this chaos in my living room. So that's how it stands out to me, as in a very personal sense. Of course, politically, as a political scientist, there are all sorts of global implications that extend far beyond the mess in my living room on that day.
I'm assuming the furniture didn't get set up that day, just given the chaos that was unfolding outside the Capitol, too.
It got done. It got done eventually. Not everything ended up a total mess.
I wonder, years later, if you think there is a legacy attached to January 6th and what you think that legacy is.
Well, I think the legacy is completely unsettled at this moment. And that is rather distressing given a couple of things. Like, first, the volume of evidence about what actually happened on January 6th, 2021. And it's also distressing because it cuts to the core of what American democracy is all about. Right? And in my view, the legacy thus far is really about a manufactured crisis of interpretation. Right? What seems to be such a clear set of facts has been muddled by, 5 years of deliberate campaigns of misinformation and misinterpretation designed to continue a political fight. Right? Whether it is in Donald Trump's political and personal and legal interests, or the kind of culture and political battles that go on in the United States. The legacy thus far of January 6th is completely unsettled, and that's by design.
I want to pick up on that point because, there is quite a bit of a revisionist history associated with January 6th, as you've alluded to, attempts primarily by Donald Trump and his allies to kind of downplay, misrepresent, or reframe what happened at the Capitol that day as something less severe, despite evidence of the contrary. What do you think continues to drive that?
What drives this misinterpretation is sort of the perpetual culture wars in the United States. Now, these cultural wars go back a century or more, and the Trump iteration is just one of them. The purpose of these culture wars isn't necessarily to resolve questions of who won the 2020 election or evolution or gay marriage or any number of these kind of touch points and flashpoints in American society. It's about keeping the battle going and mobilizing political bases for political gain. Sometimes it's political profit, sometimes it's private sector profit, but it is all about keeping the fight going for its own sake and for the sake of a political future for interested parties. So the purpose is not to resolve the question. The purpose is to keep the fight going. And that is what fuels the ongoing problem of interpretation in the face of an overwhelming body of evidence.
Professor Ettinger, we're discussing the future of MAGA against the backdrop of the events that are unfolding in Venezuela. And in speaking about Venezuela's future, President Trump has kind of rejected the concerns of many in his MAGA base. He's signaled a clear shift away from, his previous aversion for regime change and for nation building. And I wonder, yes, MAGA influencers have mostly rallied now behind the president's actions in Venezuela, but I wonder how you think his everyday MAGA supporters will respond to this.
My sense is that they will rally behind him as well, because his broad base of support doesn't really have a thick intellectual foundation for supporting the guy, right? MAGA supporters generally like him because he does harm to their enemies or their perceived enemies. So as long as Donald Trump is winning, they win by proxy. Now, that's not a very mature approach to take, and it's certainly not very healthy for a democratic society. But my sense is that, as long as the typical MAGA person on the ground doesn't feel any immediate effects of the actions in Venezuela, they're going to stand behind the president because he's their guy. And he is, the tribune of the people in their own kind of MAGA warped sense of things.
I certainly don't want to overstate anything, but do you see or can you draw any parallels between perhaps the rhetoric that fueled January 6th or the rhetoric we saw from the president leading up to January 6th and that historic day, and the justification for American intervention in Venezuela?
Well, there is a connection to be made between, J6 and J3, if we can call it that, which is Trump's, increasing authoritarian control over the levers of government in the United States, right? And in January 6, 2021, he, more or less, prompted a crowd to riot at the Capitol, and in general counseled insurrection. And basically got away with it. Sure, he was put on trial. He was impeached in the House of Representatives and all of that kind of stuff, but he never suffered any consequences. And that taught him that he can pretty much get away with anything in the United States. And that's been confirmed by Supreme Court rulings that say the president is immune from prosecution as long as he's acting within his capacity as president. Well, that tells any, leader who's watching that Trump is going to do whatever he wants to do because there are no restraints on him. And that step-by-step increase in the authoritarian capacity of the president is deeply unhealthy for democracy in the United States, which is backsliding accordingly.
I don't want to compare, apples to oranges here, but it's almost kind of what we've seen in the way that he deposed of Venezuela's autocratic leader, Nicolas Maduro. He acted with impunity, really, Trump, in taking foreign military action against his sovereign nation in that way. So that kind of lends to your argument there.
It does. Yes, Trump is acting with a degree of impunity that is, unprecedented in American history, but it didn't happen overnight, right? The legal context for American military action in the U.S. is extremely permissive. And that's a permissiveness that was enjoyed by Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush over the last 25 years, right? The only real restriction on the American use of force by the president is a 1973 regulation passed by Congress that never became a law, but it has sort of been part of this unwritten rule of dance between the Congress and the presidency about congressional authorization for the use of force. It's not a law. It's only a convention that the president needs to consult Congress over any deployment of military force. But presidents can get around it really, really easily, and Donald Trump is no fool. He sees that, and on January 3rd, 2026, he did exactly that, gifted as it was by decades of practice in the United States to him.
But it's also become clear, I would argue, that, Trump's MAGA movement has developed some really serious cracks. We've seen dismal public opinion polling in the last year. Even among the president's supporters, there's been high-profile infighting, electoral setbacks on nearly every election night in 2025. What does that tell you about Trump's grip on the GOP heading into his second term back in office?
Well, Donald Trump's grip on the Republican Party is rock solid, right? He has an iron grip on the Republican Party. On the MAGA base, such as it is, there are these kinds of fissures that you're talking about. Now, let's remember that the fate of Republicans in Congress and at the state level are intimately tied to Donald Trump's approval, right? So they are kind of supplicants to him. They need his approval because he has the capacity to kind of sick his supporters on any dissenting member of the Republican Party. Now, the base is something a little more unruly. There are these fissures within the base over things like Israel or anti-Semitism or the economy and so on and so forth, which are make those people harder to wrangle. Right now, for the most part, they're going to coalesce behind Donald Trump or his various minions around him because he is their, he is their sword in this fight. He is the man who is going to do harm to their enemies and, maybe perhaps satisfy some of their policy preferences. But slowly but surely, we're seeing these divisions in the Trump coalition, get bigger and become more public in their profile. That could spell trouble for him in the 2026 midterm elections, but that's a long way off right now.
Yeah, what do you think this all means for the midterm elections, or should we not be reading into it too much? Because as you mentioned, we're still many months away from them.
Yeah, I think we need to read a lot into this. Right, the midterm elections typically in modern American history act as counterbalances to whoever won the previous presidential election, right? So Republican last time won, there might be a Democratic wave on this occasion. That is typically what the pattern is. Within the Trump movement, we have another problem, which is a problem of motivation, mobilization. Right? You got to get people out to vote in these midterm elections. And aggrieved parties, in this case, Democratic supporters, will be highly motivated to come out. And parts of the MAGA base that aren't so pleased with what Donald Trump has been doing so far, either on the economy or elsewhere, might not feel the same imperative to get out the vote.
Why is that?
As punishment, as penalty, MAGA supporters might not be interested in some of the dissenting arguments or something along those lines. I mean, typically participation in midterm elections is a lot lower than in presidential years. But by November 2026, I would imagine that there are going to be a lot of anti-Trump supporters that are interested in coming out and casting a correction ballot against the Republican Party.
You mentioned earlier that Trump's grip on his party remains rock solid. So would it be fair to say you think that grip can hold into what is shaping up to be a pretty significant election year?
Yes. I mean, the grip is very, very firm because Trump has the capacity to punish and penalize any dissenting voice within the Republican Party. And that's important, right? Within the Republican Party. Thus far, we have not really seen any meaningful dissent within that party. Right? There have been some senators in Congress, men and women, who have expressed concern or dissent, but haven't really done anything within the institutions to push back against Donald Trump's agenda. Now, we can talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene or some of the Republicans from his first term who dissented, but for the most part, their dissent came on the way out. Right? They left their seats, they left the Senate, they left the House of Representatives, and continued their kind of dissent outside of the institutional halls of power. That matters because within the institutional halls of power, they have leverage and they have the capacity to frustrate Trump's agenda. Right? It's easy to be a dissenter on the outside. On the inside, it's a whole other story.
So you don't think the infighting that we've seen in the last year and some of that dissent is a political risk for Trump?
It's a political risk, but so far he's been able to weather those problems quite handily. All he has to do is make up a silly name for an enemy and have that person expelled from the party, or symbolically expel the person from the party. Right? It has worked quite nicely so far. And until I see somebody openly break with Donald Trump and stay in their seats in the Republican Party in Congress, then I'm going to be convinced that Trump still has an iron grip on his party.
Fair enough. I wonder, because obviously there can be a populist movement in the U.S. with or without Trump, but I wonder if there is a MAGA without him.
Is there a MAGA movement without Donald Trump? That's sort of a question that we've been wrestling with since the end of his first term. Right? Does Trumpism continue without Donald Trump? And I think the answer is probably yes. Right? The MAGA movement is this odd coalition of different kinds of conservatives to the far right and extreme right wing of the American political spectrum. And those ideas and those movements and those interests are going to exist beyond the Donald Trump presidency. And whether or not they can be mobilized by a talented politician after Donald Trump is another story, right? You got to collect and wrangle all of the cats. You got to herd the cats into some sort of coherent political movement. And that usually requires a talented bundle of elites to do so. Trump's genius was his ability to forge this coalition and more or less hold it together for the last decade or so. Can the next guy in the MAGA movement, the next leader of the MAGA movement, do the same? I don't know. That remains to be seen.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Given deepening fractures, can Donald Trump transfer his political support to other candidates and MAGA be successul? Because after the midterms comes 2028, and constitutionally, Trump can't be on that ballot.
Right. This is a question that we've asked before, and most recently with regards to Barack Obama. Now, I think Obama represents a really interesting analogy to Donald Trump. Now, Barack Obama was a uniquely talented and charismatic leader who was able to build a broad coalition for the Democratic Party. But once his distinct personality passed from the political scene, the Democratic Party kind of fell into shambles and was only cobbled together to an election victory as a counterpoint to Donald Trump. Will Donald Trump be able to find somebody as charismatic, as entertaining, as fun, as sharp as he is in order to lead the next wave? Maybe, but if you look around his administration, the obvious candidates are not especially persuasive or convincing, to me at least. I mean, J.D. Vance, the vice president, is probably the successor to Donald Trump. But he's not nearly as fun or engaging or charismatic as is Donald Trump. Right? I can't see him riling up the masses. I can't see him, standing in front of a 20,000 seat arena and getting whoops and hollers the same way that Donald Trump did. And that was part of Donald Trump's appeal, is his transgressiveness and the fun that you could have transgressing social and political norms. Vance doesn't have that, nor do many of the other characters in his administration right now.
Aside from the fact, as you mentioned earlier, that historically the president's party loses seats in the midterms, do you think Republicans should be worried heading into an election year?
The Republicans should be worried because they are not particularly popular, right? Nor are the underlying public opinions on things like the economy especially encouraging for them, right? So Trump's approval ratings are pretty low. People don't feel as if the economy is particularly strong. Now, I mean, that might fluctuate from month to month with jobs reports and whatnot, but the sense that inflation is still up and not going down and economic hard times are upon us tend to work against the incumbent party. And in that case right now, it is the Republican Party in the White House and in both houses of Congress.
I suppose then as Republicans, eye the midterms with growing anxiety for those reasons that you've just laid out, what lessons can they learn from January 6th?
To learn lessons from January 6th, you would have to actually look the facts in the face. And that's something that Republicans at the elite levels have completely been unwilling to do, at least publicly, for the last 5 years. Right? What was January 6th? It was an insurrection, right? It was a disruption to the democratic process by violent gangs. Right? This is an affront to democracy in the United States as a whole, and symptomatic of a deeper illness within the American body politic. Right? A responsible Republican would seek to address the foundations of this kind of illness and resolve it somehow. But as long as the Republican Party is in the grips of Donald Trump, who can mobilize this far-right and extreme right-wing movement behind him to punish elected Republicans, there's not going to be any resolution to what January 6th is all about. Which is all to say, first you have to recognize that there's a problem before you can resolve it.
And does that make another January 6th all the more likely?
Likely is a hard thing to predict. So long as there's a permission structure that enables radical and extreme right-wing movements, including the armed wings and the militant wings, to be part of the political process, there's always the potential for political violence. And that should be extraordinarily distressing for Americans and for, small d Democrats around the world.
I guess, given this context, is there anything in particular you'll be watching for, come this new year? Already a busy one from a U.S. policy perspective.
Yes. What's next? Okay, we have Maduro kidnapped or arrested, or however you want to put it, and these claims by Trump and his administration that they are going to take over Venezuela or govern Venezuela. My question is, okay, how? What are you going to do? Is this going to involve some sort of occupation force, some sort of proconsul, like Paul Bremer in Iraq? Are you going to use the Venezuelan architecture of power somehow, some way at a distance? How is this going to work? And if it doesn't work, what are the implications for the U.S. military authority in the Caribbean, the credibility of American foreign policy moving forward? What we saw on January 3rd only opens up far more questions that I don't think the administration thought about before they undertook this action.
Okay, Professor Ettinger, appreciate your insight and analysis today. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. You can send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, reach us on Instagram at frequencypods, or on Blue Sky at The Big Story. If you know someone who might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them too. You can listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks so much for listening.